You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade. Today on From Embers, I'm sharing an interview with Aaron Lakoff, a longtime independent media producer and anarchist organizer based in Montreal, and also, incidentally, one of the first anarchists I ever met when I first moved to that city as a starry-eyed 18-year-old wannabe anarchist, at least 12 years ago. Okay, maybe 14, 15 years ago. We had a chat last week about his new podcast, Changing on the Fly, which is coming out today. Came out today, I guess, October 3rd, 2018, and explores the intersection of hockey and radical politics. I knew I wanted to interview Aaron as soon as I heard he was putting the project out there because I personally have all these questions, and I think a lot of them sort of come out on From Embers about being in Canada, wanting to talk about some of the things that are specific to being an anarchist in Canada in terms of the specific federal state that we're dealing with as people who want to oppose the state, and also about relating to Canadian nationalism in all of its particular wishy-washiness. But wanting to do those things without taking borders for granted and without speaking as if the Canadian nation is something that I think actually exists and actually connects us all from coast to coast, when I think it absolutely does not do that. I don't think there's a Canadian anarchist scene that this podcast is about, but I do think there are questions that come up here in Canada or in so-called Canada that don't come up in other countries, and especially that don't come up in the United States, which is where a lot of our media, both anarchist and not, comes from. So I guess I sort of saw myself in Aaron's podcast pitch, not because I like hockey, because I honestly really don't, but because hockey is such a big part of the fiction of Canadian nationalism. So I think we got into a lot of good questions, a lot of questions that are the questions that really made me want to launch From Embers. So I'm really excited about this interview, and I hope you guys all like it. Here it is. How would you briefly describe your new podcast project that you have coming out?
So Changing on the Fly is a podcast that looks at the intersections between hockey and social justice. So the way I've been jokingly describing it to people in terms of putting it into cultural reference terms that I guess are more familiar, as I'm saying, think of Colin Kaepernick or Serena Williams, but with skates and with less teeth. And so, yeah, so it's a podcast that I would say hopefully speaks to radicals just as much as hockey fans, and kind of, in a sense, tries to bridge those two worlds. Because I think that for far too long, the left and for radicals in general, we've kind of shunned sports, and which is fine, because I often say sport very toxic environments for a lot of people. And so I get that. But it's also really important, I think, that, as people with radical politics, that we invest ourselves into sports, because it's a site where millions of people are paying attention, and it's a site of oppression as well. And, as radicals, we never shy away from a fight in terms of trying to combat oppression wherever it exists. And so, when I started to see all of these amazing protests happening in the last few years, more so in American sports. So, players refusing to stand for the national anthem in the NFL, basketball players in the NBA and the WNBA speaking out. I started to kind of really wonder, like, why have we not necessarily seen these kinds of protests in hockey? And oftentimes people will say, like, the easy answer is that hockey is a much whiter sport than those other sports I just mentioned. But that's really only scratching the surface. Actually, when you start to kind of peel back the layers, you realize that, there's this history of people of color in the sport, making innovations in the sport, changing the sport of hockey, going back over 100 years. But also, like, indigenous had such a profound impact on the game of hockey, yet those are precisely the histories that are silenced or that are left aside. And so what I'm really trying to do with Changing on the Fly is to, like, center all these voices precisely so that we can, like, bring a more radical approach to try to weed out the things that disgust us about hockey culture, like the racism and the homophobia and the misogyny.
Do you have any specific topics in mind? Any episodes that you're particularly excited about?
Totally. So the first episode that's going to be launched on October 3rd is, I guess, like an anti-colonial look at hockey. So kind of, I wanted to start at the point of, of course, like acknowledging that I'm a settler on Indigenous land and that it's produced on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk territory in so-called Montreal. But then also, there's this real problem if we're referring to hockey as Canada's game, because what does that mean for all of, like, the thousands of Indigenous people in this country who are invested in the sport, who play the sport, who are fans of the sport, yet who don't see themselves as, like, subjects or citizens of, the Canadian nation state. And I really wanted to, like, unpack that. So I went at it from a few angles. The first is looking at the history of hockey in Canada's residential schools and how hockey was actually introduced into residential schools, not as, like, a benevolent, oh, hey, let's have fun by playing hockey. Quite the opposite. It was actually introduced as a tool of assimilation, right? To try to wipe out the Indigenous cultures that kids were coming in with, and also, to tire them out, right? Because a lot of youth in the residential schools were running away en masse, and so these evil priests who ran the residential schools thought, well, if we give them a sport, like let them play hockey, it'll tire them out, maybe make them complain less. And of course, this whole narrative, this history around hockey in the residential schools was maybe popularized through the amazing novel by Richard Wagamese, who's a Ojibwe writer. So he wrote the book Indian Horse, and then that got adapted into a movie. So it's out. It has been out in theaters for a while. Don't necessarily recommend the movie, but the novel is amazing. Highly recommend people check it out. And so the novel is essentially just about that, about a native kid who is kidnapped from his family, put in a residential school, and ends up getting really good at hockey, but really examines the kind of colonial baggage around all of that. So that's kind of one, I guess, issue that I wanted to kind of, or one angle that I wanted to look at hockey from. But then the other, of course, and this gets talked about a fair amount in football and in other big American sports, but not so much in hockey, is the racist use of Indigenous mascotry or Indigenous symbols in hockey. So people might be familiar with the large campaign in the U.S. right now to try to get Washington's NFL football team to drop their racist name. Maybe people know the name. I'm not even going to say it because it's an awful racial slur. So that's been, a big issue for years. Also, the Cleveland Indians baseball team, they actually, there was a big battle that was just won this year. The team has finally agreed to drop the symbol, the awful racist chief. He's called Chief Wahoo. So they're not going to use that symbol anymore, which is a big victory for Indigenous people who've been saying for decades, like, how dare you use like our proud symbols as just like cheap, like knockoff mascots in order to sell merchandise. The Cleveland Indians, of course, are still going to, unfortunately, carry on using the team name, but it's significant that they're not going to use that symbol anymore. But in hockey, we of course have the Chicago Blackhawks, right? And that's a whole controversial thing because it's a team that's has really nothing to do with Indigenous culture, but they're using the image of a Native man on their jerseys, and there's a debate and a divide within Indigenous communities about that too. I'm not going to say it's monolithic. Not everyone agrees that mascot is racist. But I did an interview with this awesome Indigenous clothing company based out of Vancouver called Section 35, and they put out a whole line of clothing critiquing the Chicago Blackhawks logo. It's called "Kill Mascots, Save the People." So, of course, a take on that slogan, "Kill the Indian to save the child." Mm-hmm. So that's something that we look at. And, yeah, that's going to be the first episode. And, from there, we're going to get into, like, a lot of different issues, looking at, like, feminism in hockey and the rise of women's hockey leagues, looking at homophobia in hockey and how to challenge toxic masculinity in the locker room. Like, for me, it's really fascinating because we're seeing these like big spikes in athlete activism during the age of Trump. And it's because I think in some ways, like, Trump is so extreme and he gives so much fodder to the media and to athletes to just kind of take what he says and to kind of like pick it apart from so many angles. And so maybe your listeners will remember, this was even before Trump was elected. During the campaign, it was very close to the elections, that awful tape of him came out saying, basically boasting about his sexual assault and saying, "Grab him by the pussy." Mm-hmm. And then, so he was, of course, forced to apologize for that. And he said, he dismissed it by saying, "Oh, that's locker room talk. That's locker room talk." To which a lot of athletes who were kind of like, quote unquote, woke, responded, "Oh, well, like, not in my locker room, like that's just not the way we talk about women in my locker room." And like, while I liked that response, while I liked athletes kind of coming out and saying like, "F you, like, how dare you say that's locker room talk," as if to say that that's all that happens in locker room. Unfortunately, that kind of like toxic masculinity is very present in a lot of locker rooms. Like, we can't deny that, right? And so for me, it provides an opening to start to think about, like, how can we actually attack these hateful viewpoints, not just as like kind of sensationalist, like, oh, this is something that Trump said, and it's for sure not isolated incidents, but like, this is part of like systemic rape culture. This is part of like systemic patriarchy. And start to like unpack how that's like manifested through sports.
Do you like sports? Like, do you have a personal relationship to sports that brought you here?
I do, yeah. That's a really good question, because I think for me it was really important to produce this podcast kind of like by and for hockey fans. Although I should say, it's like, I think that even if you're not into hockey or into sports, you might still appreciate this podcast because it's taking a critical look at all these different social movement politics. But yeah, like so many people in so-called Canada, like, I was brought up playing hockey. It was always something that I was completely surrounded by. And then when I was a teenager, I was like still playing hockey at that point, not like super high competitive or anything. I was never actually that good at hockey, but it was just something that I always loved. And, I just remember like coming off the ice after games, and because I actually wasn't that talented as a hockey player, like the amount of like insults and hate that would get heaped on me and like all the shame, right? So the most often thing was like people would like call me a fag or a loser just because like I missed a pass or like whatever let in a goal. And this is kind of like what I walked away from, is feeling like, why is there this awful culture even within like youth sports, you know? And it really drove me away from hockey. And then I think like when I got really involved in radical activism, and especially like really interested in anarchism for the first time, I just thought that there was like this polemic divide between the sports world and the activist world, right? Like to me, there was no way to reconcile them, because like after all, it's like how could you on the one hand say that you want a world that is free of sexism, free of racism, free of capitalism, you know, on the other hand, be like interested in a sport that is basically a platform for all of those things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think where I've kind of come to at this stage in my life is to actually realize that you can reconcile those two parts of your life. Like there's no need for them to be separate, you know, because like you can still be a fan of sports, you can still be interested in sports, yet come to it with a critical perspective and say like, you know, it doesn't actually have to be this way, right? Like it doesn't have to be the fact that when you go to an arena to watch a game, you're completely bombarded by awful ads. It doesn't have to be this way that, you know, sexism and racism are just the norm on the ice. And I've again started to really think about like sports as a potential site of radical organization, right? Like on the left, for decades, we've seen, you know, workplaces as a site where you can organize people. We've seen schools and campuses as a site where we can organize people. So why don't we seriously look at the arena as that kind of a site? And we're starting to see it more. I think that, like, for example, in other parts of the world, like if you take Egypt as an example, or if you take parts of Europe as an example, and especially within like soccer culture, like soccer has had a really radical culture around it for a long time. And it's because, first of all, it's a much more global and working class sport. Like all you need is a ball to play it. And, you know, there was at one point in Europe, like a rise of fascism within the fan culture. Like, for example, in England, like the BNP, British National Party, would, you know, go to soccer games to try to recruit youth to join this fascist movement. And so anti-fascists who were going to those soccer games were like, to hell with that, and started to actually organize like anti-fascist supporter clubs to kick these fascists out of the stands and out of the arenas. And it really actually worked to a large extent. I mean, unfortunately, you still have far right leaning or fascist supporter groups in Europe. But, you know, at least they're met with like a hard fight. And that's inspiring to me, right? Like that again is saying we won't let this sport that we love be reclaimed by the far right. And so we're going to organize within the sport. You know, like one way to say it is like, okay, well, we're just going to like boycott sports because they don't conform with our values and our way of seeing the world. But another way is to like actually invest ourselves in them, and to try to kind of bring a revolution about from within. And I mentioned Egypt too, because, you know, if you look at like the Tahrir Square movement and the Arab Spring movement, ultra clubs or like football supporter clubs were actually a very big part of those protests to overthrow the government at that point. So I would love to see those radical elements of football or soccer culture kind of like eventually permeate into the hockey world. I think that we're far from it, but my hope is that like putting a podcast like Changing on the Fly out into the world is like a very modest gesture, in terms of trying to open up these conversations in hockey. And you asked me about like, do I like sports or do I love sports? I do. And I think that more people would love them if we were able to like, you know, have more of these conversations and try to make them spaces of resistance and of joy and of tolerance and acceptance rather than bigotry.
I think like a lot of radicals would, maybe they wouldn't say they disagree with you, but they would prefer to ignore sports as a terrain, like either because of like bad experiences or because of a sense that's sort of like a lost cause, especially something like hockey. Why do you think it's important for us to talk about sports and politics in particular and not like ballet dancing in politics or like any other kind of realm in politics?
Oh, well, I mean, I think like ballet dancing and radical politics would be amazing to talk about too, right? Like, I think that that as radicals, we actually need to be more invested in these cultural sites, right? Like these places that people come to and congregate around. You know, there's a very conscious movement to try to keep politics out of sports, right? So this comes from the reactionary right. People who have attacked like Colin Kaepernick and others for taking their stance, they say stick to sports, right? Just get out there, like play the game and shut up. And that is a totally absurd notion because like sports are already inherently so political. And so I think that a lot of radical work or like the work that the anarchist movement does, I see as like revealing, right? Like we're always trying to reveal to people like what are the true material and social conditions of the world we live in, and trying to like get people to question the hegemonic narratives that we're brought up with, right? Like just the absurd notion that Canada is like a good liberal state. Like, okay, if we want to contest that, how do we, you know, show not tell? And so I think that like looking at again the history of hockey in residential schools is a useful way to start to like break those narratives and introduce new ones. And you know, at the same time, like I totally want to recognize that point you brought up that like, yeah, I mean, people are completely within their right to hate sports, you know, because I recognize the trauma that sports can bring about too. Like, I'm not going to say I was like traumatized necessarily in sports because like I'm someone who has a lot of privilege as a white cis male. But yeah, like for lots of folks, like queer folks, women, you know, people with disabilities, probably have either a lot of baggage, yeah, or a lot of trauma just through like, you know, being shunned, like being put on the sidelines. To me, it's not about trying to valorize these like professional athletes who are doing amazing things. For me, it's about really trying to find ways because I do ultimately think that sports are really important, whether we like them or not. But that's neither here nor there. That's kind of like saying music is important. I think music is important. Not everyone likes music, and that's fine. And there's some things that I don't like that are important too. But again, like sports as a place where millions, if not actually billions of people in the world are paying attention, are watching, and do find it important, and trying to bring more of a radical culture to that. And I could talk a bit more about, you know, as an anarchist, where I see some of the kind of potential connections between anarchism and sports are as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that later, but go ahead now if you want to.
Sure. Well, so this is, I think, a good kind of discussion to start. I'm hoping to like actually write more about this in the near future because there's a lot of leftists who are writing about sports from a radical perspective. Not so many anarchists are doing it. There are a few for sure. Like Gabrielle Kuhn is a great anarchist sports writer. Matt Hearn and you know a few others. But I think like for me, I would hope that we still have lots of sports in an anarchist society. But I think that the sports that we have are going to look very, very different than how they look right now. And so I think it's a useful practice as anarchists and a useful exercise to think, well, so how would we want to remodel sports, you know, within this kind of better world that we're trying to create? And I think that, you know, that there's like a few different things there, but like one for me that always really stands out. And I think about this all the time when I'm like in a street demonstration or when you know, like we're in more militant actions, let's say direct actions, riots, what have you, I think a lot about teamwork, right? And I think sports can be a great entryway to think about like the formations that we have, whether it's on the ice or on the football pitch, and the kind of formations we'd want to have with comrades when it's going down, right? Like you want people to have your back. You want to be kind of strategically looking around you and saying, you know, where's the best way out? What kind of leeway do I have in this kind of situation? Like really thinking on our feet and but also, you know, thinking very much in terms of a team. And again, it's like, I recognize that there could be a lot of like ableist language bound up in that. But even to bring it back on another level, when you think about a team, you think like everyone kind of brings like a different special thing to it too. And I think sports can be a really great exercise in terms of like trying to apply just that teamwork kind of thinking to a more militant level. So that would be like one connection that I would really see. You know, the whole gender segregation in sports is really interesting because obviously as anarchists, we're trying to fight against the gender binary and we're trying to fight for a world where, you know, gender does not shape who we are necessarily as people or, of course, our material conditions. And maybe the logical conclusion for people would be like, well, we would just end like the whole idea of like men's sports and women's sports, because in any case, like where do trans people find themselves in that? But what's been interesting for me is talking with a lot more people who are involved in women's hockey. They might not necessarily agree with that, right? Like maybe a more logical conclusion for people would be like, obviously the problem with gender segregation in sports is that our society affords way more attention and way more resources to men's hockey or men's sports in general than they do to women's sports. And so we would obviously want to, you know, completely flip that in an anarchist society, but also just like allow for like gender self-determination within sports. So what I find like really inspiring, really fascinating is that women's hockey leagues like the Canadian Women's Hockey League and the National Women's Hockey League in the US, they totally like allow trans players, and there's like at least 2 like out trans women who play for those leagues. And so like there's an opening there that doesn't exist, of course, in men's sports. And yeah, just like thinking about like sports as a place where we would like allow for more gender self-determination and breaking those gender binaries. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's like, it's so full of potential. And if we just kind of like open up our minds to kind of start thinking about like, oh yeah, another thing, of course, too, I'm always very excited talking about this. You know, I was watching the World Cup a lot this summer, as billions of people around the world were. And I love the World Cup because I love the fact that people are so invested in it and are so excited about it. But I really hate, you know, the nationalism that's bound up in it, right? Just whatever, like people cheering for different nation states doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And so I would love to think about a world, you know, if we're trying to get rid of nation states, that these teams wouldn't necessarily be nation states competing against each other, but maybe we would bring things back again to like the neighborhood level and trying to have a lot more pride in like our own communities. So like not thinking about, oh, I'm going to be cheering for the Canadian national team, but I love where I'm from. I love my neighborhood and I love all the people here, and really kind of thinking about, I don't know the word exactly I'm looking for, but you know, breaking things down onto kind of a more like geo-specific level where we're not thinking about nation states, but we're thinking about other kinds of community-based formations.
You are listening to the podcast edition of From Embers, an anarchist radio show and podcast based in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And this week you're listening to an interview with Aaron Lakoff, a longtime media activist based in Montreal, about his new podcast, Changing on the Fly, about the intersection between hockey and radical politics. as a break, I wanted to play this song, which I can, for once, also play on the radio because it has only one swear word and it's produced in Canada and it follows all the dumb rules I have to follow at the radio station. And Aaron requested it and I also like it. So here you go, podcast listeners. Also, here is Propagandy with Dear Coach's Corner. what would you say are the politics of the podcast? Or is it like an anarchist podcast? Is it something else?
It's not an anarchist podcast in the sense that it's not like the focus of it isn't anarchist politics. To be honest, I haven't really thought necessarily of the political orientation of it because it's just very much like I do the podcast from my own politics, which are of course motivated by anarchist ideals and anarchist causes. But I also recognize that like there are very few people in the hockey world who are going to outwardly identify as anarchist. So I'm always much more of the opinion that like we start, building with people who maybe share some of our beliefs, some of our values, but maybe not all of them, and trying to like get into discussions and debates with people so that we can at least start to tease out these ideas and these values that we want to build the new world with. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily like have a specific political orientation beyond wanting to kind of get rid of Canadian nationalism within hockey, which I think is very much consistent with anarchism. So,
yeah. Do you think it's possible to separate hockey from Canadian nationalism?
I do, for sure. I think it will be a hard thing to do because, again, like, that's something that unfortunately so many people in this country see as like this specific point of pride. Mm-hmm. And I would like us to have other points of pride, and again, to kind of try to challenge the fact that like we see hockey as Canada's national sport, but why should it be something that is claimed as such, right? Like, yes, it's something that in a way kind of binds people together from coast to coast, but that in a way kind of cheapens it too, because like for me, like nationalism is really cheap. Like nationalism is just kind of this false identity that we slap onto ourselves. Like when I think of Canadian nationalism, I just kind of have to laugh because I'm always brought back to that awful like Molson beer ad in the 90s, the I am Canadian, where the guy just like lists off basically all these ways that we're different than Americans. And that's really cheap. I'm just like, how can we seriously ascribe to this? Like, I think pride is kind of a natural and good feeling to have, but I think that we need to take pride in our communities and having international global communities. I think we need to take pride in, building communities and movements that are fighting for a better world, but not to take pride in like, some weird false identity that like, in reality, there's not that much materially that binds someone living in St. John's, Newfoundland, someone who's living in Iqaluit, Nunavut, someone who's living in Chicoutimi, Quebec, and Chilliwack, BC. I mean, besides the fact that we're all living under this colonial nation state. So maybe we need to put the focus back on that. Like, what is this colonial nation state? What's it doing to people? And how can we talk about that through the lens of hockey?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people would say, like, when you ask that question, like, oh, what do people have in St. John's in common with people in Iqaluit, in common with people in BC? Like, they would say hockey, right? Like, that's one of the points of unity that people claim to have. Are you worried that doing a podcast in Canada about hockey could potentially sort of reify that in any way?
That's a really good question. I think what I want with this podcast is for people to see themselves in it in some way, but also to maybe walk away with a questioning, like a critical questioning, because I think that's always so important, right? Like, I think that we constantly have to be not just questioning like the world around us, but also questioning our own beliefs and our own politics, right? If as anarchists we're not able to be self-critical, I don't think that we're actually doing that important work, of building a strong movement, because it's not like our ideas are untouchable or infallible, right? Like, I think that actually sometimes they are. And we emerge as stronger communities and stronger movements when we do go through those processes of self-reflection. So it's not like there's any questions or any issues that I'm necessarily afraid of attacking for fear of like maybe opening up a conclusion that I'm not so comfortable with. But what I want to do again is like try to bring a discussion into a space. So the space being hockey and the discussion being, you know, social justice, movement politics, that hasn't really been done to a large extent. I shouldn't say like it hasn't been done at all. There are for sure people doing that work, not necessarily in a podcast form. And so I think also like as a medium, like podcasts are really exciting because a lot more people are turning to podcasts for like news and information. And so again, it's like I see it as a very modest thing. Like I don't think it's gonna change the world or like change the hockey culture overnight. But I think if like more people are adding their voices to this discussion and creating media around these questions, I think it can end up having a snowball effect, hopefully.
Honestly, I'm pretty there with you when it comes to sports and politics, or even sports and anarchism. But for some reason, the hockey thing is kind of like, it's a little bit hard to picture. It hasn't always struck me as like a radical sport. And even in your own promo, you sort of mentioned like every sport but hockey. What would you say to persuade me that hockey could be a site of radical action?
There have been small things that have happened in hockey, like little sparks that in and of themselves might not amount to that much. But like just as one example, the U.S. women's hockey team went on strike last year to basically just demand like a fair wage for their work, right? And before the strike, it was kind of a given in the U.S. that like, why would we pay women athletes? You know, like, duh. And what those women did by going on strike is like completely challenge that notion to its core, to say like, no, like sports, yes, sports are fun, they're play, but for a lot of people who choose that path, it's also work, it's labor, you know, they're selling their labor. And so they went on strike and they won, you know. And so now the US women's national team like actually makes a living wage, right? Is it as much as NHL players make? Like, no, not by far, you know. But like, I for sure don't think that athletes should be millionaires. Like, I think that like that's always been an absurd thing to me, is like, why is a professional athlete making more money than like a teacher or a nurse? Clearly that's a problem with capitalism, but I digress. But like, I think that those little sparks can eventually amount to something, because I think that like all revolutions start with a little spark. It just kind of, you know, the question is like, how is it taken up, right? Like, how do we throw oil onto the embers? Maybe that's a good lead-in with your podcast.
What about capitalism? Like, a lot of professional sports seems like pretty intertwined with capitalism. Even fandom can sort of seem like brand loyalty sometimes. Do you think pro sports are redeemable? Can we move them away from like a hyper-capitalist place?
I think, yeah, I mean, with pro sports, they would probably have to be done away with in an anti-capitalist society. But what I would still hope for would be like this appreciation of athletic excellence, right? Because I think at the end of the day, we want beautiful things. You know, after the revolution, we would still want to have beautiful music, beautiful art, beautiful paintings. And I think in a way, like sports have this kind of beauty that people are searching out the same kinds of things they are when, you know, we look for that excellence within other sectors of culture, if you will. But I think like that excellence is like, we would just kind of like value that in and of itself, right? Like it's again, we're not looking for a society where people are rewarded monetarily for making these beautiful things. Like, we want a society filled with beautiful things for everyone. And so I would hope that sports would kind of like be something like that, where you could still have fabulous hockey players, you could still have fabulous long distance runners and fabulous musicians, and people would, be fairly compensated in, whatever form that is, and be able to live off of it, but not become insane millionaires at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Who do you hope is going to listen to this podcast? Is it more sports fans, more radicals, more sort of like sports players?
Well, I hope it's like a combination of both. I don't expect that like your average everyday hockey fan is going to get really into it, although I would hope that they do. But this idea that I kind of like, that the radical sports writer Dave Zirin always talks about, is trying to bring, if you make an analogy to a newspaper, trying to bring the sports section to the news section and trying to bring the news section to the sports section. And again, in the sense of like recognizing that everything is inherently political, that all these spaces are political. I would really hope that, people who are really into hockey, but who might feel some kind of alienation from the hockey world, again, because of all that baggage that hockey culture is bound up in, I would hope that kind of they see part of themselves within this. I would hope that radicals who maybe aren't necessarily that interested in hockey would at least be interested in like having that discussion on like, yeah, like how can we disentangle Canadian nationalism and hockey, or how can we disentangle toxic masculinity and hockey. And so I do think that there's kind of, in some ways, something for everyone in there. But when I say something for everyone, I mean people who either see themselves in the radical activist camp or the hockey camp, because again, it's so much just about trying to find those bridges.
And why do a podcast in particular?
It's kind of like the medium that I've been working in for a really long time. Like I have about like a 15-year history in community radio. I host another podcast called The Rebel Beat. I work quite a bit with the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. And like I was saying before, I think in a certain sense, I don't like saying it's the future of radio, because I think that there's always going to be important spaces for radio and social movements. But I do see it as something that a lot of youth are turning towards in this particular time and place. And I do see radical potentials just in podcasting, because like radio, it's a medium of access that's relatively easy to produce. And it just seems like the time is rife for more radicals to be producing podcasts as well.
But why a media project rather than like going out and playing hockey, or like starting like a radical gym, or joining a sports team?
Good question. Well, so I actually do play in kind of a radical hockey league here in Montreal. It's called the Lovely Hockey League. It is an awesome mixed gender. It's all based on anti-oppression principles. So it's really trying to be welcoming to people of like all different, not only all different skill levels, but like obviously trying to be welcoming of people who, are from backgrounds who, might like face oppression or marginalization in other hockey leagues. So I do that. I would love at a certain point for there to be like more kind of like political organization within hockey. Here in Montreal, something that we have that's really inspiring is it's called the Anti-Racist Soccer Tournament, and it happens every year. So it's been going on for like 5 years now. And what it is well, the name is kind of self-explanatory, but it's just like a big soccer tournament that happens like one day a year every summer, where all of these different anti-racist organizations like Solidarity Across Borders, Mexicans United for Regularization, like a whole bunch of different groups, but also like different communities. So like the Haitian community comes out en masse, like a lot of like folks from the Tunisian community. And it's an amazing event to see like Palestinian folks and everyone just coming together around their love of football, but also like from a very political place. Like, maybe it's not like, okay, we're actually actively confronting racism in that moment, but it's building a culture around the sport where I think people can take it from there and say like, okay, like we've come together, we've met each other on the soccer pitch. Where do we go from here? And so I would love to see something like that happen in hockey. But again, I think that hockey culture, as it stands now, is quite conservative, and there's so much work to be done. So, like what you're saying is totally legit, and I hope to be doing that kind of work more throughout the years. But I kind of also like see myself and see other friends or colleagues of mine who are radicals within the game as like maybe just kind of at the starting line right now.
And what do you think a media project can accomplish?
I think starting a discussion.
Okay.
And that's a really modest place to start, but I think like a lot of different DIY projects, like, folks who make zines or, people who throw up stencils on walls, all of these are like very small things we can do, but like they're kind of like the sum of their parts, right? So like they add up and hopefully get things moving on a larger level.
Do you think we're trying to change minds?
I hope, yeah. But like that takes so much. And oftentimes, like, to be honest, I don't think that we're doing it fast enough because it's, the urgency that we're living in this world is like so dire, and the ice caps are melting. And yeah, like that's another really interesting connection with hockey is like people love playing pond hockey. I don't think we're really going to be able to do that for many more winters, right? And so then it's like, then again, it comes back to this like question around identity. It's for all of these folks who are saying, I'm a proud Canadian and I love hockey, and I grew up playing hockey in my backyard because that's an experience that unites so much of that. Well, it's like, okay, well then how proud can we still be by the fact that like we're destroying this so-called country of ours and this climate of ours, and our future generations are not going to have that experience of playing outdoor hockey, right? So yeah, again, it's that's a heavy thing because it's like the world is changing so fast, and I'm not sure if we're keeping up, but we're all trying, right?
I sort of see this project as kind of similar to your other podcast, like inserting politics into a space that you happen to already care about. In one case, it's music. In this case, it's hockey. Do you share that sense of like similarity between those projects?
Yeah, I do. Although, like with the Rebel Bead, it's kind of an easier thing to do in a certain sense because there's so much radical music out there. So I usually don't have to look very far to be like, oh, here's an amazing like, indigenous like trans hip hop artist. Boom, like let's interview them. That's much harder to do within hockey because again, people who have been like living those kinds of oppression have been like so shut out of the game. And so I think that we start to kind of crack these spaces and open up these spaces and try to build the kinds of spaces that we want that will like invite people back in, but also like push out the haters, push out the bigots, right? Like that's a really important thing too.
Do you have a sense of the impact that your other podcast has had? Do you get feedback? Obviously enough that you wanted to start a second one.
I do. I mean, like, I hear from listeners on a pretty regular basis. And I think what I love is just like how it kind of connects people who are doing on the ground work that I find so inspiring. Like, this was like totally random, but I was at a friend's wedding in the States a few weeks ago, and like this woman comes up to me and she's like, oh, like I recognize your voice. Like you're that guy that hosts the Rebel Bead. And like, she starts talking to me and like, she's doing all this amazing work, doing legal support for water defenders in Standing Rock. And, she was able to actually like connect me with like a bunch of indigenous hip hop artists who were like really foundational to the struggle there. And, for me to know that it's like, oh, like, yeah, like the Rebel Beat is like kind of in a certain way, like inspiring people who are doing that on the ground work that I'm trying to highlight. And in turn, like it's kind of like an inspiration loop because their work inspires me, and then I in turn hope to put out something that will like inspire them. But of course, it's like, I'm not trying to speak to the converted either. Like I'm trying to really reach beyond, and that's, I think that again, that's why sports are really powerful, because it gives us such a fertile way to like not preach to the choir, right? Like it's really not preaching to the choir. It's like preaching to like a very hostile environment. And I shouldn't say preaching, like hopefully it's not preaching, but trying to speak to a hostile environment to change minds or to introduce new ideas.
Yeah. What do you think it is about audio? I mean, okay, I feel like From Embers is my first audio project in a long time, but I've been writing zines for years and putting stuff on the internet, various like written word kind of stuff. And the amount of response I get for the audio project is like at least 5 times anything I've ever written. I don't know if this is something you also like, maybe, I don't know if you also write or if this is something you relate to. Do you think there's something about audio right now that's like more appealing to people? It's like reaching more people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't write that much. I've written a little bit. I think the culture that has always existed around zines is really cool because it kind of creates this sense of like intimacy and community around certain projects or certain ideas. But with audio and with podcasting right now, I think what we're seeing, so like there's been this explosion, of course, podcasting. And, a lot of that is because of like these very mainstream podcasts like Serial and This American Life. And I think that what we can hopefully do, like those of us who are producing radical podcasts, is kind of like ride the wave of like their momentum a little bit. Obviously not try to emulate what CBC or what NPR are trying to do, but like what's interesting to me is that I was reading a study done about podcasting because I'm a geek like that, and in 2016, 96 million Americans had downloaded at least one podcast, and that's astounding to me. That's like basically a quarter of the population. So like 1 in 4 Americans has downloaded at least one podcast. Now, that's not necessarily the same numbers that are like watching TV, or maybe that's not the same numbers that like have a Netflix account or a Facebook account. But like that is actually like what we're seeing is like the emergence of podcasting as a mass medium, a mass media, because it used to be super like underground and obscure. We're talking about a medium like podcasting has only been around since 2004, right? So it's still very young. And I think like when any technology emerges, it kind of goes through this period where it's like underground, and then becomes mainstream, and then it gets contested. And maybe we're in this period where like we need to like fight to like reclaim that technology a bit, because it is concerning to me that it's still Apple that controls most, like pretty much all of the podcasting world, right? And it's still like a lot of these like big companies. And so I would love to kind of come back to like that era of like early 2000s, like indie media ethic, where, like indie media was like the OG Facebook, like we were doing that way before this Mark Zuckerberg had this idea to like launch this website. Like we were doing that self-publishing stuff, right? Long before your Googles and your Facebooks. Like anarchists actually, I think, revolutionized the internet in the sense to like bypass all these big companies and say anyone should have the right to like, oh God, I hate using the term free expression right now because the alt-right has completely reclaimed that, but like self-publish, right? And we've kind of lost that tradition through social media, and that's really sad. At the same time, I see social media as this kind of like almost unavoidable beast, because it can be a useful thing to like share ideas and to share our media projects, although not the only way. But I really hope that like in the years to come, we're really putting an emphasis on like trying to actually build the radical and directly democratic platforms that we want to have that can kind of like bring us back to like that era of indie media.
Cool. This might be kind of a weird time to ask you this, but I'm really excited for your first episode. Can you tell us when it's coming out and how we can find it, despite the fact that I assume now you're going to have to rep like Stitcher, iTunes, all these things that you just criticized?
Totally. Well, anyways, knowing that there's a strong critique of all that, the first episode is coming out on October the 3rd. And people can subscribe on all of those evil platforms like iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. But, like if you don't get your podcast that way, I'd say the best way is to just like go to the website, which is changingontheflypodcast.wordpress.com. There's probably something evil about WordPress that I'm not aware of. And you can find all the episodes there. There's an email address people can get in touch. It's changingontheflypodcast@gmail.com. Yeah, the first episode is going to be that anti-colonial episode that's coming out.
Thanks for listening, and thanks again to Aaron Lakoff for that interview. As always, if you want to get in touch with us, give us feedback, just chat, propose a show idea, you can reach us at fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks again.